I'll speak to Eli Clifton, who's a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, joining us from New York. Welcome to Al Jazeera. How effective do you think the sanctions will be in deterring violence in the occupied West Bank?
Thanks for having me. Well, there's no evidence that these sanctions to date have deterred settler violence at all. But they do serve a couple of important roles. They do offer a fig leaf for both the IDF's complicitness in enabling and protecting settlers to act with impunity. And, perhaps more importantly for the Biden administration here, it attempts to preempt questions for them about U.S. military aid to Israel and the decision not to designate specific IDF units as participating in human rights abuses. Now, that's a designation that could lead to the use of U.S. law, the Leahy law, to withhold weapons transfers to those units. So those pressures, they're particularly acute right now in the final months of the U.S. presidential campaign season. So
what you're saying is the U.S. just doing this sort of as a distraction then?
Well, I think it partly as a distraction and partially to manage a difficult situation when you have 44% of likely Democratic voters opposing U.S. military aid to Israel, at least in terms of its war against Hamas, with only 25% in favor. So they have to do something, but they don't want to do something that actually could have long-term effects on the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Why now, though? Because there's years of accumulated evidence that this particular organization has been funded and supported by the Israeli government, as well as senior members of the NGO are affiliated with the parties of the ultra-nationalist ministers like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who, as you know, have called for violence against Palestinians. So why now?
Well, I think that, we're facing unusual pressure right now for the administration to do something, because not just in the presidential election cycle, but there's also a growing concern that the war in Gaza and now the expansion of the military actions by the IDF into or broadening their activities in the West Bank could actually pose to be a spark to light a regional war. And so there certainly is a strong desire in Washington to prevent that, but there's also competing pressures not to do something that would fundamentally change the U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, all of this is coming at the expense of U.S. policy in the region that could actually help de-escalate tensions with Iran and Hezbollah and could help bring a ceasefire in Gaza and a release of hostages. And those are policies that wouldn't only benefit people in the region, but it would also serve U.S. national security interests of avoiding getting drawn into another endless war in the Middle East. So unfortunately, the policies and the sanctions that were just announced, it's to present the appearance of doing something, to express disapproval with what's happening, but not to actually take the types of actions that Democratic voters would want and are pushing the president to undertake, but also the types of actions that could actually make a difference in Israeli policy in the West Bank as well as in Gaza.
Look, speaking of Israeli policy, the head of the Shin Bet himself, the Shin Bet, of course, is the Israeli Secret Service. He said that settler violence is doing indescribable damage to Israel. Do you think that the statement will make officials in Israel and even in the United States stand up and take notice? Or do you think that state-backed settler violence, as described by organizations like Amnesty International, is state policy?
Look, the alarm bells are certainly ringing both in Israel as well as here in the United States about the policies that Israel is undertaking in the West Bank as well as in Gaza. However, this war has been going on since October, and the reality is that there hasn't been much of an effort to actually constrain or curtail Israel's actions on the ground. So is it state policy in Israel? Well, certainly it appears to be the policies of the War Cabinet in Israel. And in as much as it affects U.S. policy, it doesn't seem like policymakers in Washington are willing just yet to take the types of actions that might be required to try to change the policies of the War Cabinet.
All right, Eli Clifton, thank you so much for joining us.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.